It's my privilege and honor to be here with my colleague and friend, Rabbi Mike Uram, who went to Wash U and JTS, and for about 13 years now has been the executive director of the Penn Hillel, one of the most successful Hillels in the country, not only for what it does on campus, but as a national model, international model of launching new programs and new institutions out of that Hillel. And when I worked in the Hillel world, you were the gold standard of what it meant to be a Hillel director. So thanks for taking this time to talk.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So I know you just released this awesome book, Next Generation Judaism. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you is a claim that you make that there is no such thing as the Jewish community.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
So it's an interesting thing that if you look around at the way that organizational leaders talk, whether it's federation leaders or synagogue leaders, even JCC leaders, there is this oftentimes we say like the Jewish community, the community of Scottsdale, Phoenix, the Jewish community of Philadelphia. And it sounds like a nice thing to say, like to imagine that we're actually all one big Jewish community, but if you dig down a little bit deeper, it creates all sorts of problems. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is that if there is the Jewish community, and there are so many Jews out there that feel like they're outside of it. They don't feel like they connect. They don't feel like they're good enough. They don't feel like they have the right background. They don't feel like they go enough, whatever that means. So if all the languages, you're either in the community or out of the community, so in that binary choice, they end up feeling like they're out. For anybody who doesn't fit in, who doesn't fit into one of those nice little boxes, the Jewish community is painful. I think the second piece of it is it skews our strategy. Even organizations that are trying to innovate and trying to do all sorts of new things, they tend to take a one-size-fits-all approach. So I'll give you an example. So if a synagogue wants to get more people to do adult learning, so what they do is they come with a cooler brochure, better titles, more offerings, and they promote it, but ultimately it's still like same product, teachers, passive kind of clients listening to the classes that are being offered. And it's true there might be some marginal increase, but the reality is that there's huge groups of Jews that we're missing when we do that one-size-fits-all approach. So in the book, so there's one last piece I think that's important. One of the other ancillary things that grows out of the one community language is like all sorts of terrible language. Are you affiliated? Right. Do you show up? Do you come to programs? Right. And basically every Jew is not actually judged on the Jewish stuff they do, but on how much they participate in institutional Jewish life. And you have all these linear spectrums: involved, uninvolved, religious, not religious, knowledgeable, not kosher, not kosher, right? And the truth is, not only do people feel judged by that, but that language doesn't inform you in any meaningful way about what might actually be a next meaningful engagement for them.
So what's some alternative language you might suggest that we embrace?
So in the book, I suggest two pieces of language. Many years ago, Richard Joel was the president of Hillel International, and he was a master of language. And one of the terms he came up with was engagement Jews and empowerment Jews. And it sticks, and it has stuck all these years. But I think what Richard meant back then was engagement Jews were Jews who didn't come to Hillel, and empowerment Jews were Jews who did come to Hillel. And the goal was to get all of those engagement Jews to become empowerment Jews. So since Richard coined those terms at Penn Hillel, we've really developed that language. And our goal is not to get one group of Jews to be like another. So we see both engagement and empowerment Jews as positive terms. And this is how we describe it. So an empowerment Jew, which is like you and I, we're now consummate empowerment Jews. It just means we have deep Jewish resumes. We know all of the alphabet soup of the American Jewish community. Right. We're following what's going on in the Forward or in the JTA or what's happening with J Street or PIPAC. And basically we feel comfortable in Jewish spaces. Even if we don't always love it, we have enough Jewish background to feel comfortable. Engagement Jews are different. Engagement Jews have shorter Jewish resumes. They feel just as Jewish, and they are, but they just don't have the institutional experience. So when they show up in formal Jewish spaces, they often feel like they don't fit in, they don't know how to get in. They're often like deeply wanting more Jewish connection, but they're not just going to show up.
So, I mean, what you're saying is inspiring, and it's also scary, because I think part of what you're saying is that Jewish institutions may actually be alienating in many ways more than empowering.
So I would actually say that without doing anything wrong,
Yeah.
Jewish institutions are absolutely alienating, not because of any fault of their own,
Right.
but it is the nature of groups.
Right.
Once you have a community that has boundaries,
Yeah.
right, or a piece of a community that has boundaries, for it to feel like something, it has to
Right.
be homogeneous,
Yeah.
and it means that others are excluded.
Right.
So the mistake that we're making is not that we're not being warm and welcoming. You can be warm and welcoming, and it's still, I mean, we all know that, right?
Right.
You can greet somebody in an incredibly warm way,
Yeah.
and they still don't feel like they belong.
So, like, what are other measures of success? I think the community often talks about numbers.
Yeah.
How many showed up at the high holiday services? How many were part of the campaign? How can we shift that framework to think about what success looks like in engaging people in Jewish life?
So I think the first part of that answer goes back to the engagement and empowerment divide, because I think it's important to say this, that if you really try to split American Jews into those two categories, my guess is, what I put in the book was that 25% of American Jews were empowerment Jews, and then about 75% were engagement Jews. I actually really think that number is much, the number of engagement Jews is much bigger. It's probably more like 75, it's probably more like 85%. And so I think the question of, like, how do we measure success is, part of it is shifting to realize that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. You can't just do more of what you're doing with the same people and think that you're going to reach Jews who live in different social networks, who have different assumptions. And I think that, so one of the ways we could really change that, like, my mentor, Jeremy Bruchan, used to ask Hillel directors this question, and it would, like, knock them off their seats. He would say, are you spending 90% of your time on 10% of your constituents? And for him, he meant, like, we spend our time with our regulars, with the Balabatim, with the people who show up. And some of that is productive time, like it's the classes we teach and the youth groups that we run. And some of it's like the complicated organizational stuff, like having boards and committees. But the reality is we have to find a way to break out of that cycle of sustaining and doing the same thing over and over again to be able to reach out over there.
Yeah.
So I think the second piece of it is, Heschel actually talked about this. He said that, it's a funny thing, he was talking about Judaism here, not just society in general, but he said in Jewish life, we're starting to spend so much time talking about the community and about the society and about the people that the individual has gotten lost. Heschel said that we have an edifice complex, that we are building these beautiful buildings, but we're not taking the time to actually build Jewish life in them. There was a very prominent rabbi said to me, if I have to choose between the pastoral and the institutional, I always choose the institutional because the pastoral is bottomless. So there he went, he built a beautiful library in Beit Midrash, and there's no one there.
Right.
So I think that that's the big shift. If we could invert the values pyramid, instead of focusing on what the institution needs, focus on what people need. Start there. It changes every conversation. That young couple that shows up, instead of trying to sell them on joining, you're getting to know them. You're finding out what they need, how you can help support them in their Jewish journey. All of a sudden you're making an impact on their lives, not selling them a membership. And the dirty little secret, right? Whenever I say this around the country when I'm touring for the book, is, oh, that's great, but we have to keep the lights on. Membership is how we keep things moving. We need the annual campaign for the Federation. But I think the dirty little secret is that actually the way that you make the institution strong is by making a huge difference in people's lives. And then they want to give back. They want to make sure that someone else can have that experience. It's actually much easier to sustain an organization on the impact you're making than on a membership or an annual gift or something like that.
So we started off talking about, is there such thing as the Jewish community? How about peoplehood? Do you believe there is such thing as the Jewish people? From a historical, biblical, Talmudic, halachic, philosophical, theological perspective, do you believe in the concept of the Jewish people?
So one of the things that I talk about in the book is that there has been a shift towards micro-communities and that we have to get on that train. And there's a terrible fear. It's like micro-communities, but like, what about the community? What about the feeling of having 500 people at Kiddush or 2,000 people at high holiday services? So I actually think that the language around the community is actually pretty recent, and it's really institutional language. It's language that rose up when there were institutional things taking care of a geographic area, like a federation.
Right.
But if you look philosophically, throughout Jewish history, it's always been a more nuanced, more matrixed view. So the classic midrash is that even at Mount Sinai, even though God was revealing God's self to the entire people of Israel, it's described as having 70 faces to the Torah. People were experiencing it differently. The Kotzker Rebbe says that everyone receives equal measures of the Torah, but they only are able to access it based on their own unique capacity. So if you look throughout Jewish history, I think if you look at Eastern Europe, even the way we kind of imagine the good old days, was it one Jewish people, or was it really sects of Hasidim, different Hasidic sects, Litvische Jews, reformers, people involved in the Haskalah, people involved in the secular Bundist movement? All of these different forces were coming together, and it wasn't just one. Mm-hmm. And I think the other proof of that is when you ask people, whether they're your grandparents or little kids, whether you're Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, or nothing in terms of denominational affiliation, tell me about some of the most powerful Jewish experiences you've had in your life. Yeah. People aren't telling you about being in shul with 2,000 people. They're not telling you about Kiddush. Mm-hmm. They're talking to you about relationships, their grandparents, a teacher. They're talking to you about Shabbos dinners. They're talking to you about Passover Seders. Mm-hmm. And so therein, like everything else in Judaism, is a dialectical tension. Yeah. We are both one Jewish people on Pesach and Pesach Eve, all having Seders all around the world, even though we're at our own table doing it with our family and friends. Right. And we also know that we're part of an eternal Jewish community that's been having Seder. Mm-hmm. And we can hold that. We can understand that we're both at our own table in a micro community and part of something much bigger. And I actually think that Judaism is most alive when it's in that dialectical tension between the imaginary whole and all of these networked little parts. I think when it's at its most dead, when we try to pull everything into one generic community, because inevitably it's a one-size-fits-all.
So my last question then is, what does this mean for the philanthropist who says, I'm afraid for the survival of the Jewish people, and they want to invest in the system that's going to keep the whole system going? Yeah. Right, this sense that if I invest in this institution, they're the ones who are kind of pulling everything together. How would you respond to that approach and to that fear that we need to kind of keep this whole unity together in some sense?
I mean, I feel it. I mean, I also worry about that, but I don't think it was ever real.
Right.
And so I actually don't think that the loss that we feel is not of the Jewish community. The loss we feel is that the individual Jews and the networks of Jews aren't living as vibrant Jewish lives as maybe they were at other times in Jewish history. Yeah. So what I would say to philanthropists is, I think you have to have a balanced portfolio. Mm-hmm. So I think the part of what I tried to do in the book was to avoid the binary thinking that it's either do what we're doing or throw it away and do something new. Right. What I actually think we need harmony between legacy organizations and startups. Yeah. And so I would say have a balanced portfolio. Right. And I would also say I think the greatest philanthropists I know are generous not because of the money they give, but because they're generous of spirit. Right. Right. And so you find people that you trust and give them room to create. Right. And then amazing things happen. Yeah. You can't always decide what the outcome is before you start. Sometimes you just got to do it.
And in addition to building, I think we have to become comfortable with death. As human beings, we struggle with our own mortality. But the death of parts of Jewish life, that's very scary to people. Everything, survival does not necessarily mean every aspect of what we've been should continue. Yep. Recipes can evolve. Institutions have to evolve. Our practices evolve. And that happens in every sector. There's no sector that freeze dries everything. When you freeze it, it changes also. So I think that this sense of being able to mourn parts that go, but from a Darwinian perspective, some things won't make it. And from a hashgacha perspective, from a perspective of divine providence, that things are being guided, that things won't make it. And to be okay with that. If in some institutions close or some ideas don't make it, or the community looks fundamentally different from 50 years ago, which we know is true. Just look at our engagement with Israel, 1967 to 2017, fundamentally different. So it's really inspiring what you're doing. And I think that the fact that you're doing it on a campus is the best, workshop incubator to be doing this stuff. So check out this book, Next Generation Judaism. Also check out the podcast from the lecture tonight about this book, which we will post below in the comments. Rabbi Mike Uram,
thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.